Hey there, homestead dreamer. Whether you're just starting out or have already dipped your toes into the homesteading world, I've got something special for you. It's all about setting up a solid foundation for your homestead plan and income strategy through thoughtful action and implementation. Because let's face it, starting a homestead is not too difficult, but keeping it sustainable can be a real challenge. Now, the decisions you make in those early years can truly make or break your experience. You either end up feeling confident and content, or you find yourself caught up in a never-ending struggle, like on a hamster wheel. And we definitely want to avoid that. That's exactly why I've created an amazing resource for you, the Workshop for Beginner Homesteaders and Dreamers. With this tool, you'll have a rock-solid foundation to build your homesteading dream upon. In the pre-recorded workshop, you'll dive into some valuable topics such as strategies for planning, savings, and generating an income, how to find and become a part of a supportive homesteading community, and developing the right mindset for homesteading success. And here's the cherry on top. Throughout the month of June, I'm offering my workshop for beginner homesteaders and dreamers at a special discount price. It's an hour and 40-minute video where I personally guide you through most of the Homesteading for Beginners workbook, which is included in the workshop price, by the way. To grab this offer, head over to healthyhomesteading.com/workshop and use the code podcast at checkout. With this code, you'll get over 20% off the already low regular price. But remember, this discount is only available during the month of June, so make sure you take action soon. You can find all necessary links in the show notes of this podcast episode as well. I'm eager for you to get started. Let's make your homesteading dreams come true together. This is part 2 of the interview with Melissa K. Norris. I was editing this audio and I realized I must have been so focused on Melissa that I did not hear my grandkids screaming in the background. So there's a portion of this that you'll hear my grandkids in the background, but this is life and this is how we do things when we have families. So I just wanted to let you know about that, but let's get right into the interview. I would like to go a little bit through the rest of the list, if that's okay, and just talk about like best practice tips for the rest of the list, the rest of the 9, so the 8 left. Maybe in the order of, so root cellaring is not difficult. That was, kind of that you don't even have to have any extra equipment to do that. You just need your space. Yeah. So like maybe in the order of easiest to hardest, if you want to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I feel like freezing is probably pretty easy. It's just how much freezer space do you have, right? And then understanding with using the freezer that when you're freezing vegetables at home, like fresh vegetables that you've got either from the grocery store or your own garden or farmers markets, wherever you're bringing them in, that certain vegetables do need to be blanched before freezing. And the reason for that is because they're freezing, that doesn't stop the enzyme activity. And it doesn't kill bacteria. It just puts everything in a hibernation form. So that's like you freeze raw meat, but once you thaw it, you still have to cook it in most cases, right? So with some of your vegetables, I have not really most fruits, but most of your vegetables, if you don't blanch them, you can either do it in boiling water in each vegetable will tell you like how many minutes or seconds, or steam blanching them before freezing, then you'll set yourself up for failure. The texture will be off. Flavor can be off, and they just won't ever cook back quite right. Whereas if you do blanch them, the ones that need it, it really is an important step. I skipped it when I first started freezing some of our winter squash, and I couldn't figure out why when I went to cook it 3 months later, it would never cook. I'm like, I've baked this for 2 hours. It should have been done in 20 minutes. And it had just had an off flavor. Not like it went bad, but it just didn't taste good. And that's where I realized the importance of blanching. It wasn't a suggestion.
Right.
It was something that I should have done.
Okay. And I wouldn't have even thought of, I don't think I've ever done that for winter squash. I'm not sure that I can remember if I've frozen winter squash before, but I wouldn't have thought winter squash, you would have to do that. I mean, like green beans and things and tomatoes, I get those, but and you said winter squash or regular or summer squash, did you? Or both?
Winter squash. Okay. I will, it depends Summer squash, zucchini specifically.
Hmm.
If I'm wanting to freeze it like in rounds or slices, then I will blanch it. If
Hmm.
I'm grating it up and it's going to go in like a bread where it's, really incorporated with a lot of other stuff, grating wise, I
Hmm.
don't blanch it. But I
Okay.
do if it's like the round medallions or quarters, depending on how big it is by the time I actually pull it out of the garden.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in case someone does not know what blanching is, can you quickly explain what that is, that process?
So blanching is where you're putting something in either steam and or boiling water, not to fully cook it, just long enough to stop that enzyme activity that still goes on after harvest. And that's what goes along and actually breaks down food and then transitions to rot, etc.
Mhm.
So blanching stops that, but it's still considered, it's not fully cooked. So it's still mainly raw. It's just been blanched. So like things will still be crunchy, as far as like green beans and that type of thing. They're not like a fully cooked version of it. And so, yeah, that's blanching.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So, what would be maybe next on the list? Or, it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be exactly easiest to hardest, but I
Yeah.
thought we'd get into the more difficult ones at the end.
Yeah. Well, I think next would be fermenting because you
Hmm.
really just need a vessel, a mason jar, a crock, a glass bowl, anything like most of us have some type of that in the kitchen, a
Hmm.
good quality salt. And that means a salt that doesn't have any anti caking agents added to it or iodine because iodine can interfere with the fermenting process.
Hmm.
So you just need a good salt, your vegetable, and a glass container. Mason jars work great. And then you usually need some type of weight. You don't have to buy a weight. I've used old little glass jars and filled them with water, like old baby food
Hmm.
jar, but just something to keep the contents that you're fermenting, the solid parts of the food, beneath the brine level so that it doesn't mold. It needs to be beneath the brine level. So you can make your own weights. I know even people will take like a Ziploc bag and fill it with water and then put that on the top.
Hmm.
In order to keep it down. You can also buy little glass weights. They're fairly inexpensive and you can reuse them time and time and time again. They're really great. I have those.
Hmm.
And you can get fermenting lids for your glass jars that help let the gases escape, but also keep the bad bacteria from entering in until it's got its established pH. Because the act of fermenting, it's actually acidity and salt. So you have enough salt that it keeps the bad bacteria from growing and keeps that at bay, while
Hmm.
you have your lactobacillus bacteria in vegetables is creating an acidic environment. It's really cool. So it actually
Hmm.
creates an acidic environment. And then you have all of the great probiotic parts that are in the food and all of this good gut bacteria. And it acts as the preservation mode as well. The only caveat with fermented foods is most of them, in order to keep them long term, you are going to need to move them into some type of cold storage after they've reached your fermented part. And that cold storage just greatly reduces how fast it's fermenting so that you can enjoy it for a long period of time. So for a lot of people, that's a refrigerator.
Hmm.
But it also could be a room, especially if you're fermenting in the fall and you have a room that you can kind of close off that doesn't get as much heat. Ideally, it would be between like 35 degrees. You don't want your ferments to freeze to like 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Just
Hmm.
know if it's warmer than that, you're going to need to consume it faster or it will reach the past of too fermented, which usually just means
Right.
it's way too sour and all those
Hmm.
different, it's just not palatable. You're not going to enjoy it.
Right. What do you recommend, like people starting to ferment? Like what types of food? I know cabbage is always a good one to start with, but what would you say, including drinks? Because there's kombucha and water kefir and those sorts of things too.
Yeah, I actually prefer kombucha because water kefir is too high maintenance for me. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
have to feed and strain something every day or every 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
So I prefer kombucha because I can let it go or I can just put it in its little SCOBY hotel and we're happy. And it doesn't take my fridge until it's finished and I'm, ready to put it in the fridge. But I can just keep it all on the counter. So I tend to be a little partial to kombucha between those two personally.
Mm-hmm.
And then cabbage is nice because cabbage tends to have a lower or lesser frequency to want to mold. So if you're brand new and you don't maybe have some of the airlock system lids, I have found that some of the other vegetable ferments can be a little bit more prone to cam yeast, which is not harmful, but it's not always desirable, or mold contamination, where I find the cabbages, those ferments tend to do better. So like a kimchi, my favorite is curtido, which is a Spanish version of sauerkraut, where you're using carrot and garlic and onion and oregano. And I don't even make regular sauerkraut anymore. I only make curtido because we love it so much.
Is that in your book? Is that recipe?
It is. Yes, that recipe is definitely in the book, and it's my absolute favorite. So those are probably my favorites. And then my daughter loves, though, fermented. I still make canned ones, but she loves fermented garlic, dill, cucumber fermented pickles. So I always do several gallons of those to keep her going throughout the whole year. Yeah.
Okay.
So fermenting is great just because you can do it in small batches. If you only have a little bit of something, you can do it in small batches, and you don't have to have a lot of equipment. And it's so good for you. So fermenting is one of my favorites. I would say next is going to be probably infusion. And so infusion is just where you are either infusing the fruit with alcohol to help stabilize it, or the vice versa. Like if you're using herbs, you're actually infusing the liquid with those herbs. And then sometimes you're straining it out, which would be medicinal herbal tinctures, but you also can do it for flavoring. So you can do, homemade lemon extracts, almond extracts. Of course, vanilla extract is something a lot of people are familiar with, but that is a form of infusion and preserving that food as well. So those are relatively easy because, again, you just need to have the alcohol and or vinegar. You can also do vinegar infusions. But that liquid, a glass jar, and then whatever you're infusing it with, herb matter, fruit. Usually it's herbs and fruits. Those are your general ones. But again, pretty easy to do. You don't have to have a ton of equipment. And then sometimes you do oil infusions are another one. And this is where we do need to talk safety for a minute. So when you botulism is probably the most dangerous form of food poisoning that you can get because it's a fatal neurotoxin that you actually have to get an antidote to. It's not like you just get sick and throw up and then you get over it like you would, Salmonella, E. coli, some of the other things we think of as food poisoning wise. Botulism is not one of those. And botulism, you can't smell, you can't see, you can't taste, you cannot identify it by any way, shape, or form until you start to come down with the symptoms, which can be blurry vision, weakness of limbs. Like there's some symptoms. The good news is it's actually very, very easy to avoid if you are using updated, safe, tested methods of home food preservation and you understand how it proliferates and how to avoid it, which is one of the biggest things that I wanted to hit with the book, because a lot of people think botulism with canning, but you can get botulism in other forms of food preservation. Salt curing with meat is one of those, as well as oil infusion is another. And so with the oil infusion, because it doesn't have, so botulism won't grow in acidic environments. So 4.6 pH on your pH scale or lower, because the lower the number, the more acidic. Botulism cannot grow in an acidic environment. So that's why you can water bath can fruits, and we can do a lot of different things like infusing fruits and all that, and you don't have any issues. If it is 4.7 or higher, so you're going more alkaline, right? Then botulism can grow in those environments if it's present. And because we can't see and identify the spores, and they can be all over. They definitely are in the ground. Root vegetables are a higher likelihood of having botulism. But again, it can be in meat. It can be in the air. It can be on surfaces. We come in contact with it a lot, but we're not ingesting it in a form where it's been allowed to proliferate and it's harming us. So in an area that is not acidic and is anaerobic, does not have oxygen. So inside oil, if you have something in a jar of oil and the oil is covering the top of it, that's anaerobic. A sealed canning jar, that's anaerobic. Inside of meat all the way, then it's not close enough to the surface to have the oxygen hitting it. Those are anaerobic environments. So that's where we need to be careful. So with infusion, a lot of times people want to make garlic oil. Garlic is a root vegetable. Garlic has been shown to have botulism in it, and garlic infused oil specifically has tested positive for botulism. So if you want to make those infused oils, you can. However, 3 days in the fridge, this shocks people when you're doing garlic. If you're just doing garlic with straight oil, 3 days in the fridge, and then botulism can grow even in the fridge, and that needs to be tossed. You can put it in the freezer to prolong it longer. Or you can acidify it. So there are very specific instructions that you can acidify it to extend the shelf life in the fridge. But just know garlic infused oil is a botulism danger. And so anytime you're using oil as your infusion mechanism, you need to be making sure you're following tested recipe, et cetera, to avoid that.
Okay. Real quick, you said 3 days in the fridge, that stops the botulism?
No, you have a 3-day safety window with it in the fridge to use
Oh,
it.
I see.
Doesn't stop it. So after 3 days in the fridge, you
Okay.
need to toss it.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I
make
see.
small amounts, right? Small
Okay.
amounts, or just keep out the amount you're going to consume within 3 days, still in the fridge, and
Okay.
then freeze the rest. Yeah.
I see. I see. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. What's next on the list?
Okay. Up next, I'm like, okay, which ones have I talked about here? We've done, okay. Then I'll say salting and smoking and dehydrating. They both use similar mechanisms. As I said, you're pulling out the moisture, and then it's so dry that you're not going to have the breakdown of the organisms and mold growth and all of those things. With the salt curing, you have to be careful with nitrates versus nitrites. And then also if it's on muscles or big cuts of meat, to ensure that it's properly infused with the salt so that you don't get the possibility of botulism. And so that we go into greater detail within the book. We don't really have the scope to dive super deep into that. And I don't think that's a method that most people are looking to start with. However, like making, homemade beef jerky, and you can smoke that, or smoking meats. Those are all great. They do help preserve it, even though typically we still store them in the fridge. But it does definitely preserve it versus a fresh fillet a fish, for example, sitting in the fridge. If it's smoked, it'll sit in the fridge much, much longer.
Right.
And then salt, though, same thing. It's pulling out the moisture, but I love to use salt for a lot of my herbs. I make herb salts, especially herbs like basil, that I don't bother dehydrating basil because I find that it doesn't have much flavor after it's been dehydrated, like nothing like when it's fresh. And so I make basil salt. I also make celery leaf salt. And so you just use whatever salt that would regularly be in a recipe. With all the celery, I'll use the celery salt, but it really keeps that fresh flavor alive. And so that is one of my favorite, and really easy, because all you have to have is the herb. I use a food processor or a blender. You can even pulverize it by hand if you have a mortar and pestle, to the salt ratio. And that's all you have to do. And then it stores. Yeah. So that one's one of my favorites. And then dehydrating, because you can dehydrate some things without an actual dehydrator. If your oven will go down to a low enough temp and you can prop open the door, you can dehydrate certain things. An actual dehydrator is nice because it allows you to select specific temperatures and maintain that evenly. But you don't have to have a dehydrator to necessarily dehydrate, especially leafy things like herbs, things like that. I'll just hang bundles upside down and let them dry that way, just completely air dry. So I feel like that one's a lower barrier to entry for certain things. And
that's probably that's probably my favorite one, is dehydrating. And that's the one I did the most, because that's how I used, that's what I did with my excessive amount of summer squash. I would dehydrate them and make different spices with different, with peppers. And summer squash make really good thickener for like spaghetti sauces and things like that. So dehydrating was my favorite, and I wanted to always get into the salting of herbs. That always sounded really good, and for some reason I just never went that direction. But yeah, those both are my favorites, probably, if I were to pick two. And fermenting.
And the salting of the herbs, like, it's just so easy. Like I love easy, quick ways to do it.
Yeah.
And so that leaves us with, where are we at here? I need to check my list. Canning. We've got canning and then freeze drying. And I would say freeze drying is lab, because you have to have a freeze dryer in order to freeze dry. And those pieces of equipment, they're great, but they are about, for a small one, you're looking at about $25, $2,000, and then they kind of go up from there. So it's a significant investment for most people. So they can be a fabulous, great arsenal tool in your home food preservation, skill set, but they do have the most amount of money as an upfront investment. So that's why I put them at last. But as far as ease of doing, they're super easy. You're just loading your tray, you're pushing it into the machine, and you're pressing the button. And then at the end, you're just checking it to make sure it is fully freeze dried and doesn't need a little bit extra dry time if it's not completely finished. So as far as like hands-on and ease of doing, freeze dryer is probably the easiest, like least amount of prep and all those things, but it's that monetary investment. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So for canning, water bath canning is fabulous for acidic items, as I said. So that's going to be the majority of your fruits. Not all, like bananas are not acidic enough on their own. There's some melons aren't acidic enough, but pretty much all of your berries, stone fruits, etc., are completely acidic enough to safely water bath can. And of course, there's jams, jellies, the fruits themselves, wholes, halves, fruit butters, all those things. And then pickled. So pickled vegetables, of course. Surprisingly, pickled eggs are not safe to can. They're too dense, and they have been tested to show botulism. So pickled eggs can be stored in the fridge, but they're not a canning item.
That's
yeah, a lot of people don't really. It's the density. So the brine, even with canning, can't get into the center of the egg penetrate far enough in order to kill botulism spores. So but the great thing about water bath canning is you need to have your canning jars and your lids and bands and then your food, but you can use any large pot as long as the water completely covers. We'll pretend my coffee cup is a canning jar here. Once it's put into the pot, you need to have something on the bottom. So if you buy a water bath canner or a steam canner, they'll come with a rack because you don't want the jars sitting right on the bottom of the pot. You need them a little bit lifted up off with the water flowing underneath, but you can use like a twisted dish towel. You can use the extra round bands that come with your canning jars, and you can make a rack like that and put those in there. So you don't have to have a rack. You can make one. Put your jars in, and then the water, once the jars are fully submerged, needs to cover the top by 1 to 2 inches. If your processing time is longer than 30 minutes, which there's a few recipes and they involve tomatoes that have a longer processing time, you need to have that 2-inch so that even with the lid on, it doesn't evaporate too much and that there's always liquid covering the top of the jar. So that's just making sure you have a large enough pot that is deep enough. Once the jars are in there, you've got that over the top. So as I said, water bath canning for pickles. And again, like with canning pickles, just make sure that you are following a pickling recipe that has been made for canning wise, because just because a pickle, like a fridge pickling recipe, doesn't necessarily have a high enough concentrate of vinegar for it to be safe to be canning with. And so that's where I see a lot of people, like with homemade tomato sauce recipes, just want to make their favorite tomato sauce, but their tomato sauce generally, like spaghetti sauce, pizza sauce, etc., people will be adding in peppers and onions and garlic, and tomatoes are already borderline on not being acidic enough. And so when you add in peppers and onions and garlic, those are non-acidic items. You are actually changing that ratio to above a 4.6, and then it's no longer safe. So the canning recipes, and I go over that too, pickling brines, etc., when they've been formulated for canning, it's to ensure that the end product is that 4.6. There's the pH part, but there's also the density part. So a lot of times people are like, well, I'm just going to get a pH tester and I'm just going to test. Well, that tells you your brine is, and that would prove true for pickled onions, right? But you're not able to test the density of the item and the inside of it to ensure that the inside of it, and pH little test strips, those little paper litmus tests, they're not accurate enough for canning anyhow. It's not a safe measurement, even if you are just testing your brine. So that's just making sure that you're following canning recipes specifically for water bath, and then you're going to be fine. Then we move into pressure canning, which is where a lot of people get nervous and don't want to jump into that realm. But pressure canning, it's, if I could only pick one thing.
I was going to ask you what your favorite one was. That was one of my questions.
It's pressure canning because one, it's all shelf stable. So we do have deep freezers, and I use them because I'll be honest, I'm not pressure canning my steak. I want my ribeye as a ribeye on the grill. Even though you technically can can steak, you can can meat. So we use our deep freezers mainly for I buy whole chickens. I do can up some chicken breasts and different things like that. But when I want a whole roasted chicken, I want it to roast a whole chicken. So I say that because we lose power often where we
Mm.
live. And so we have a generator that will kick in. I have to actually manually go out and set it up, but to take care of the freezers.
Mm.
But all of my canned food, all of my dehydrated food, all my freezer food, all of those are shelf stable. So when the power goes out, I'm not in any danger of losing those. And
Mhm.
that's really big for me. But my other thing is with the pressure canner, I can do like meals and stuff basically in a jar, still following safety stuff. There's some things with a pressure canner you still cannot can.
Mhm.
You can't can at home dairy. You can't do flour or grains. So rice
Mm.
is a density issue. And I know you see jars of home canned chicken noodle soup at the store and chicken and rice soup, those condensed little jars. But that's because commercial pressure canners reach much, much, much higher pounds of pressure and temperatures than home
Mm.
models can. So that's the
Mhm.
reason that you'll see dairy, even like condensed milk and different things like that, store shelves, but you can't do it at home
Mm.
because of the temperature differences home models get. But I just love like busy nights. I'm like, oh, I don't have time to cook dinner. I'm just going to go grab off the shelf. I've got some canned chicken. I'm going to grab a jar of salsa, a jar of already canned, beans, black beans.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to throw together just a really quick, like a Mexican, I'm just going to dump it all together, heat it up, and then I'll cook some rice and we'll throw it over that or, whatever, throw it in a tortilla. But I can have home cooked, homegrown food on the table
Mhm.
and like as long as it takes you to open the jar and heat it. So like maybe 10
Yeah.
minutes. So for me, that's why I really, really love my pressure canner.
Mhm.
Um is for those two reasons. So and
That
it is
makes
scary
sense.
because it hisses, it is under
Uh-huh.
pressure. But all of the newer models, and by newer, I mean like 1980s or newer,
Mhm.
have double mechanisms built into them, unlike the pressure canners of old. So they
Oh,
have
okay.
two fail safes. Basically, they have two different mechanisms so that they don't explode and the lid
Mm.
doesn't come up, that type of thing. So it's actually pretty hard um, for you
Mhm.
to have a mishap that way with the pressure canner.
Yeah, it took me a long time to even use the Instapot. My husband was the one, he bought it or we bought it or we got it, and I wouldn't use it because I was nervous about it. But that's another thing I know people ask about often is, can you use a Instapot for canning?
Yeah, and it's a big no, and
Yeah.
I love my Instapot. I actually use
Mhm.
it quite often. It's a no, and the reason for that is they did third-party testing, and it does not hold the pounds of pressure in the electric pressure cookers like an Instapot. The pounds of pressure is not held consistently all the way throughout, and so when you're
Mm.
canning, it's really important that you have your pounds of pressure correct to your altitude. So if you are 1,000 up to 1,000 feet above sea level for meats and vegetables in the pressure canner, you're canning at 10 pounds of pressure. If you are 1,001 feet above sea level and higher, then you are canning, if it's a weighted gauge, at 15 pounds of pressure.
Mm.
So that's why I say pressure matters. And you don't
Mhm.
have the ability in an Instant Pot. You can't change the pounds of pressure based upon your
Right.
altitude, number one. But number two, when you're canning something, it has to be kept at that pounds of pressure for the entire time to ensure that those botulism spores have been killed. So, for example, a pint of green beans at 10 pounds of pressure for altitudes 1,000 feet above sea level or lower, which I'm only like 650 feet. So that would be me.
Mm.
It's 20 minutes.
Mm.
If it at 18 minutes drops below 10 pounds of pressure, I have to start it all the way over again. It is
Mm.
being at a full 20 minutes, whatever the time is, at that pounds of pressure for the entire time to ensure botulism spores are killed.
Mm.
So, because the Instant Pot does not keep it at the pounds of pressure all the way throughout, it'll have dips and fluctuations. It is not safe to can in.
Okay. That totally makes sense. I've never heard that explanation. I just knew it was you couldn't do it. So that totally makes sense. Well, this was really, really great information. I know that my listeners are going to enjoy this, and I know that this is going to inspire some people to get started with at least one of those preservation. Well, they probably are already doing at least the freezing, right?
Yeah, most folks are using the freezer. Yeah.
Yeah. But maybe to add another skill set to their homesteading toolbox.
Yeah.
I love what you have on in your book. It's at least this was the description in Amazon which was learn the time-tested traditional skills of preserving food at home, all in a beautiful book that you'll pass down to your children. I love that. I am a firm believer in having actual physical books. So I really think that that's part of our preparedness, is being able to have things in case we don't have the internet, which more than likely we will for a long, long time, but you never know. So have a physical copy of a book will ensure that you can pass this knowledge down to the next generation as well. So where can people find you, and where can they buy the book? I found mine on Amazon, so I know but is that the best place to find your book?
Yeah. Well, to find the book, which is a hardcover, because I'm like, I also wrote it because I wanted all of my preserving recipes in one spot instead of having to pull out like 50 different papers every time I went to do something. But I also wanted a cover I could wipe off, because I am messy in the kitchen. It's my thing. I say it's a sign of a good cook. But so I wanted something
I'll take that. I'm very
that would
messy.
hold up and that I could wipe down if I needed to. So it's a hardback physical book. Amazon is fine, or you can go to my website, melissaknorris.com, and you'll see at the top where it says shop, and there's a little book tab, and you can order it there as well. And then it ships directly from the publisher. But either way that it gets into your hands, I'm just thrilled. So either spot. I know if people have Amazon Prime, then you don't pay shipping, and that's a boon for some people. So either spot. And then my website, melissaknorris.com, a ton of recipes are listed there, and videos, my podcast, Pioneering Today podcast. So if you're just looking for a hub to look at all the things, that would be the best spot.
Yeah, and I'll have those links in the show notes as well. So, well, I thank you so much for sharing your knowledge like you do, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much for having me on, Mona. It was a pleasure.
Wasn't that such a great interview with Melissa? I just enjoyed so much talking with her and learning from her. Be sure to pick up a copy of her book, Everything Worth Preserving, The Complete Guide for Food Preservation at Home. I have links in the show notes as well of all the links that she mentioned, so just go check those out. And I hope you have a wonderful day.